no other stages of the language present. And then, so-called dead languages like Latin, for example, which in some ways is not dead because it's still used, and it has a tradition of use from the classical period all the way to the Vatican. Right? And continued growth. Latin has not remained unchanged. Medieval Latin is quite different than classical Latin. Humanistic Latin, used from the Renaissance up through the Baroque period and after, is not the same thing as classical Latin either, although it was often the classical period was held up as a model to emulate. So, diachronic just means things that happen over time, all right? So some diachronic examples of what I'm talking about. Old High German is a period of German from about 750 to 1050. Does anybody know what the period of Old English is? Saw a hand almost go up. You can take a guess. Don't feel nervous. No? Anybody have a guess as to when Old English was? Yeah.
I want to say 650 to 800.
Not a bad starting date. Not a bad starting date. A little early. But it's roughly speaking, about the same time period. Okay? When could you say, if you had to pick a date as to when Old English ended, what would you say?
Probably 1066.
1066, right? Of course, at 1066, everyone doesn't wake up and say, well, we've been conquered by the French, I guess we need to start speaking Middle English, right? It takes time. It takes time. And it filters through a number of layers. But essentially, this is roughly the same period as Old English. But Old High German is a term of convenience. Okay? Unlike modern German, like what you're learning in your textbook, the unified, standard, literary, and communication language, Old High German is only a collection of dialects. There is no unified language of Old High German. It's what we call all of the Old High German dialects. And there's a relatively small corpus of texts, unlike, for example, English, where we have quite a few texts. And there's only a certain number of types of texts, of genres, of different forms. There's some religious literature, some of which is very long, a few charms, and charms are, what's a charm? Anybody know? It's a short text, usually meant to be recited, right? Like a magic charm, think of it as something like that. For things like healing horses with broken legs, or curing your cattle with worms, right? Spoken charms. And glosses. Does anyone know what gloss is? All right. When you have, say, a medieval text, sometimes, you've seen pictures of medieval manuscripts, right? Yeah. Oftentimes, say that someone living in what is now Germany in the Middle Ages, a monk in a monastery, reading a Latin manuscript, might be reading along and find a difficult word or an interesting word, and then write down in one of the Old High German dialects above the word or below the word or in the margin or somewhere else what that word means in his language. Right? I say his advisedly because these were all men. Right? What we have are glossaries, which are collections of glosses, and that is the basis for what we call dictionaries. Those from, and you know the term glosses. You have them in textbooks and also they started off as manuscript collections of these glosses. So you might have a Latin word in one column, the Old High German word in another. And what's remarkable is that the entire corpus of Old High German, which in terms of total word count, numbers in the hundreds of thousands, more than half of this corpus is composed of glosses rather than texts, so individual words. Sometimes phrases, though, and I'll be speaking about that in a moment. And these texts, as I mentioned, were always written by monks. In fact, I wouldn't say almost always, we could say always. Some of these monks, though, were not even native speakers of Old High German. Some of them came from Ireland, which also adds another layer to how we interpret the text and the glosses that they left behind. So, what are we talking about when we say Old High German? Okay, 3 parts. The old part is easy. The German part is pretty easy. What does the high part mean?
North.
North? That's a good guess. High elevation, okay. See, high and low in the way that we think of directions makes us think of north and south, right? But it's actually used here as elevation. Where is the high elevation in the German spectrum? South, right? These are the Alps down here. That's the highland. The lowland is up by the coast, where it's the flat coastal plain. So Old High German is the old form of German spoken in the higher elevation area. In general, you see the arrows where I have not Old High German? This part right there is Old Saxon. Okay, you've heard Saxony, right? It's a region in Germany. Old Saxon is the predecessor stage to what becomes Low German eventually. You've heard the term Low German, right? There's High German and there's Low German. In the purple on the coast is Frisian, which is kind of more related to Dutch. It's also quite related to English, but it's a Low Germanic form, right? But we're talking about these other areas. So we have Old Bavarian, Old Swabish, Swabian, Frankish, etc. So, looking at glosses, we do occasionally find things like this. In the Latin text of the Tatian Gospel Harmony, we find in Latin, in utero habens. Does anyone know any Latin? Can you guess what that means in Latin? No, that's for the German. It means having in the uterus, right? So, having something in your uterus, that's something being a baby, right? A child. But the German gloss for it is so schaffen, which means thus created, thus formed, or pregnant. In the same text, in a later part, we have the Latin word pregnante, which should be pretty clear, right? And then we get the same 2-word phrase to mean pregnant. So I'm going to walk you through now terms for pregnancy in Old High German, and then we'll move to Middle High German and see how there's an interaction between multi-word units and individual words. And what I think you should keep in mind is that there are so many terms for pregnancy in every language, right, including modern English, right? Can you think of any euphemisms for being pregnant? A bun in the oven, right? Anything else? Knocked up, right? Why do we have all of these? Just keep that in mind. We'll come back. So, examples 1 and 2 are found in the text which is a gospel harmony. A gospel harmony just means that, there are 4 gospels, right, in the Bible. Well, at various times, people have thought, well, we should probably reduce that down to one text, right? One text with no contradictions, no different chapters here that aren't here. And so gospel harmony is an attempt to make all of the gospel story from those 4 gospels fit into one text. And that's what this is from. And we find these along the monolexical term. So polylexical means multi-words. What does monolexical mean? One word, right? A single word, a single lexicon. And, sorry. And what is the word for pregnant in German? Schwanger, right? So we have that already in the Old High German period. Okay. In numerous terms. I know that you don't know Old High German and you're seeing it for the first time, but it's often quite similar to modern German still. So what verb goes with schwanger here? Werden, right? Schwanger werden. Okay. So that's the normal way of or maybe not the normal way, but that's the base form to say pregnant, without using a euphemism, without using a phrase, right? So when we have multiple ways to describe the same state, whether monolexical, phraseological, or some other way, circumlocutory, this reflects one path of vocabulary development with many possible causes. Loans, when you borrow words from another language. Internally coined units, that is when something just arises within a language community. We make up new words all the time, right? Like, for example, the verb to Google, right? This didn't exist before Google. Literary language entering the spoken language or the reverse. Substitute words for taboos, and that's what we're dealing with here, etc. And so the latter tendency, that is for taboo language, increases the number of descriptions for what we could call sensitive topics, or sometimes even just culturally inappropriate topics. Like, that's why we have so many words for scatological things, right? Mean things we can say about other people, describing bodily functions and bodily fluids and all sorts of other things, right? In fact, me saying bodily functions and bodily fluids is an illustration of exactly what I'm talking about. We can see that in Old High German as well, where we get compound adjectives like kindbeer, berehaft, and haft, alongside a number of verbs. Skepfen, that's the one that we had, that is to shape, to create. Grossen, to grow. Infachern, to get. Kindon, to beget or bear children. Swangeren, swaren, etc. Swaren, what modern German word do you think that's related to? What's the word for heavy or difficult? Schwer, right? So, in Old High German, we find already a profusion of single lexing circumlocutions. Some are compounds, like kindbeer, which means child-bearing, essentially. And one phraseme, the so scapanu that we had earlier, corresponding to a Latin lexeme and phraseme.